Yes, hello everyone. You're welcome to the Nigerian Diaspora TV. Today again, we continue on our empowering the Nigerian woman program, and today we're looking at abuse and mental health in women. And to discuss this today, we have a wonderful international speaker, the CEO and founder of Potentiate LLC, an organization that helps organizations to fulfill their dreams, to achieve their mission. And she's no other person but Rochelle Sherlock. So, Rochelle, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. I actually have a presentation just to kind of walk through and help guide this particular conversation. So give me just a second here. Okay. So hopefully you can see my slides okay.
Yes, very well.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, my name is Rochelle Sherlock, and I'm the CEO of Potentiate, which is a consultancy firm really around organizational development and effectiveness, as well as leadership. And, you know, I'm really presenting today because not only am I that, but I'm also a partner with Ethos Engagement Consultancy, which is really all about gender empowerment and about really making sure that there's women equality, that they're having voice, and really building the capacity and empowering women throughout the globe. So just a little bit of background. I actually come from a place of my own lived experience. So when I talk about violence against women, I have my own experience in childhood around some of the factors that I'll talk a little bit about in a few moments. Having experienced those myself. So there was violence in our household, there was violence amongst people that we knew and in the neighborhoods, and we also lived at various times in violent neighborhoods. So, you know, I speak a little bit from that perspective, which has given me just a little of that kind of contextual insight into, you know, how that impacts how we think about ourselves, how we feel about ourselves, our mental health, and really our trajectory in terms of our career choices and our livelihoods, and, you know, we had family choices, etc. I also had an early career in family violence prevention. So because of my background, I went into child abuse prevention in particular, and I wanted to have an impact and really begin to address some of the factors that contribute to families experiencing violence, and that includes women, it includes children, it also includes elders, because they're often also victims of violence. I am a co-founder and past chair of the Solano Commission for Women and Girls, and a founding member of 100 Women Who Care in Solano County. And I've also done some international development capacity building for women-run enterprises at a couple different places. But also with Ethos of Engagement, the team who I'm just really proud to be part of is Ellen Lewis, who is a founder of Ethos, and she's the co-author of the UN Women's Inclusive Systemic Evaluation for Gender Equality, Environments, and Marginalized Voices, or what we call ISE for GEMS. And she's also an international development consultant with a degree in organization development and background in that, but really a systems thinker and a fierce champion for women's rights and women's equality. And then a co-founder is Ann Stevens, also Dr. Stevens, who's a sociologist, research manager, and she also was a co-author of the UN Women's ISE for GEMS. So, you know, together we bring some of these perspectives around empowering women, gender equality, the importance of creating opportunity, and the importance of any kind of programs and services, community programs and services, government programs and services, making sure that they are tailored to including the voices of women and marginalized voices. And then also another component of that is the environment. So, you know, I think when we look at the violence against women, one of the things that I think is really first and foremost important is to say that it's not your fault. It's not their fault. So often women who are experiencing violence or children who have experienced violence You know, because the perpetrator may indicate that the violence is occurring as a result of some action or inaction from the person who was the target of that violence. Oftentimes when people grow up experiencing violence, they tend to internalize that violence, that it must be something about them, perhaps that they deserve it, they're not worthy to be treated better, etc. And I need to state this because it's when we start talking about the facts, so much of this is very personal in our experience of it, and it's really important that you know that, and that women know that they're not at fault for the violence. But let's just take a look at violence. First of all, it is a global issue. You know, the United States is not exempt from that in any case. The United Kingdom is not exempt from that. It doesn't matter. It's a global issue, and there's some factors that contribute to that. It's a major public health problem and a serious violation of women's rights. The estimates published by the World Health Organization indicate that probably 1 in 3 women have experienced either physical or sexual violence, both from an intimate partner or a non-partner in terms of sexual violence in their lifetime. 1 in 3, that's a tremendous number, as 2/3 of women on this planet experience that. Most of the violence does come from intimate partner violence, you know, whether it's in a marital relationship or cohabitation, boyfriend, girlfriend, but a lot of the violence comes from there. And almost 1/3 of women who have been in a relationship report that they've experienced some form of physical or sexual violence. And, you know, globally, like 38% of murders of women are committed by a male intimate partner. So violence, we know, impacts women's physical, mental, sexual, reproductive health. It puts women at higher risk for contracting sexually transmitted diseases, and really limits the options and opportunities that they have in front of them. Some of the other facts about violence is that men are more likely to perpetrate violence if they have low education. They have a history of child neglect and abuse themselves. So it's been something that they've been exposed to. They saw their mother, their aunties, their grandmothers, the women in their family abused, maybe the neighboring women abused. They've seen they engage in harmful use of alcohol or substance abuse addictions. And then also when there's unequal gender norms, including just this general acceptance of violence against women, or a feeling that men are better than women and a sense of entitlement over women. So when that's pervasive in the community, then men are much more likely to perpetrate that violence. Women are more likely to experience it also if they have a low education, or they come from a background where their mother was abused, or they experienced child abuse and neglect during their childhood. And again, attitudes that normalize violence against women, that sense of male privilege, and women being perceived in a subordinate status. All of those factors contribute to violence. And you know, I want to, before I continue on this, I just want to take a pause here on that in this moment. When you are exposed, or an individual is exposed to violence from childhood, it becomes all they know. And there's a lot of factors that go into controlling the environment and really controlling the narrative around the violence that existed. From the things like, you made me do it, if you were better, more beautiful, you know, did a better job cleaning the house, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of blaming victims and individuals who are experiencing violence in that process. And so if you think of a child, part of the development of themselves and who they think they are in the world, the value that they hold in this world comes from their parents. It comes from their homes. It comes from their communities. And when they see that they aren't valued as a child or as a female, that women in their world aren't valued, then they grow up internalizing those beliefs, and really, unfortunately, in many cases, they may even adopt to those beliefs. And so this is one of the reasons why intergenerational cycles of violence continues, because it's really hard to break what becomes very normal for us. There is evidence that advocacy and empowerment and counseling interventions, as well as home visitations, are promising in preventing and reducing intimate partner violence against women. Earlier in my career, I was a home visitor, parent educator, working with families that had a lot of violence, in particular child abuse and neglect. Was a key factor, but frequently co-occurring was domestic violence in that situation. And so it's modeling, it's providing an opportunity to model healthy relationships, healthy parenting, healthy intimate partner relationships, healthy father role relationships, healthy men, kind of gender-based relationships. It's helping create skills, communication skills, relationship skills, stress reduction, connecting to a broader community of support so that people don't feel alone, that they actually have the support available to them in their community is a key piece of that as well. And then situations where there's conflict, post-conflict, displacement, that exacerbates the violence. So, we need to just think also around what is that greater kind of societal context that's having an impact on the violence. If we look at risk factors, and in some ways this is a little bit of a repeat, but I just think it's important to call this out. This is the lower levels of education. So when you don't have a sense of an education or opportunity for skills, an opportunity for economic advancement in the world, and you experience higher levels of poverty, individuals are often find themselves in communities where there's higher levels of poverty, higher levels of community violence, lower opportunities, lower community supports, and those kinds of things continue to perpetrate violence that exists against women and girls, as well as children, because it also violence is committed against boys as well as men, but in this case we're focusing on women. Any antisocial personality disorders, so if there's any kind of mental health that's going on in the home, you will see an increase in violence, substance abuse. Oftentimes people will use alcohol or drugs or other kinds of ways to cope with the stressors in their lives, to deal with maybe untreated mental health issues that may be going on. And so using those kinds of drugs and alcohol actually can lower inhibitions and can amplify violence and kind of lashing out on impulses and behavior. Having multiple partners or suspecting their partners of infidelity, that ends up being a risk factor, as well as just overall condoning of violence, and community norms that privilege or ascribe higher status to men and lower status to women. Those also. And then women, when they don't have access to paid employment, they don't have opportunities to leave those environments. And so that is a risk factor. We'll talk a little bit later around the importance of economic interventions, where we increase the overall economic livelihood of both women and men, so that they have opportunities to help reduce stress loads and to hopefully have the opportunity to leave a community where some of these ideas, as well as these structural conditions, actually help facilitate and exacerbate the violence that may be existing. Factors specifically associated with intimate partner violence or domestic violence is a past history of violence. So if there's been violence already in the household, then there's a greater likelihood that we're going to see it again. Marital discord and dissatisfaction and difficulties communicating between partners, and any kind of male controlling behaviors towards their partners. So, in my own case, when I was growing up, it was my stepfather actually was very controlling. He didn't want my mother to work outside of the house. He really controlled a lot of the interactions that we had. We were around people who tended to be more kind of chaotic and dysfunctional, and that was accepted. He was very kind of male, chauvinistic in his ideas, misogynistic in his ideas. And, so I grew up in that environment, in that household environment, which is just kind of a microcosm of a greater societal belief. And these things are changing over generations. And, and that's the hope that we have, is that it will continue to change, and it'll continue to change globally for women and girls. Regarding sexual violence and perpetration, beliefs in family honor and sexual purity and ideologies of male sexual entitlement and weak legal sanctions for sexual violence, those things all contribute to factors where there might be sexual violence committed against women and girls. But ultimately, I think what we have to go is gender inequality and norms of acceptability of violence are a root cause of violence. As we start to get in a little bit to some of the interventions, a key piece of that actually has to start at the government level. So we need to have policies, government level policies that are going to change, that are going to prohibit violence against women and girls with strict sanctions and consequences for when that violence occurs. So the United Kingdom Aid What Works program, they did a comprehensive research on the drivers of violence against women. And so this research occurred over 7 years in 15 countries. And basically what they found is that there's all of these factors are interacting. So, I talked a lot about the risk factors. There's individual factors as well as structural factors. And some of those structural factors that you'll see here on the left side of the screen is poverty. So if people are living in poverty, their stress levels are higher, their ability to focus on opportunities are less likely. Their likelihood to act out as a result of the stress are more increased. And there's a lot of factors that contribute to that, such as are there community supports that are going to help kind of mitigate some of the experiences of poverty or the food insecurity. So that's a key piece in the community. And so when we think about that, it's people end up in poverty, in part because maybe they didn't have the education, they don't have the skills development, there's not jobs opportunity, or maybe they're excluded from the opportunities that exist for reasons that are outside of their control. We also see that this notion of gender inequality, this patriarchal privilege and disempowerment of women that exists also is a structural, so it's a larger factor that contributes to violence that occurs within the household. Or within the community. And then just that normalization and acceptability of it in multiple aspects of social relationships. Those are structural factors that contribute to the likelihood of violence occurring. And as you see here, you're going to see that poverty and that gender inequality, so that's a two-way interaction in the sense that those things can, interact together to increase the likelihood of violence occurring. But then there's the individual and relationship factors. Those things increase the likelihood of these factors of poor communication, relationship, conflict responses. You might have poor mental health and substance abuse as a result of the violence, childhood neglect and abuse. And then, of course, women with disabilities are actually at a much higher rate, something like 2 times higher rate of experienced violence as a result of the disability. And ultimately, all of that leads to the intimate partner violence. This is, in the years of work that I've done around family violence, and this is one of the more comprehensive studies that I've seen out there, really taking a look at what's contributing to the violence and breaking it down into these categories, as well as beginning to look at what works. And so it's you can find their report on the by looking at United Kingdom Aid What Works, and then they have a report that you can, that's downloadable. Oops. So let's just look at the costs and consequences. So, the personal costs are enormous. People who experience violence can have serious injuries and experience death. It can, sexual violence can lead to unintended pregnancies, induced abortions, gynecological problems with the female organs, sexually transmitted infections. Intimate partner violence during pregnancy actually can lead to miscarriage, stillbirth, and preterm delivery and low birth weight baby. So just, think in the cases where a pregnant woman is getting beaten, how that can directly injure the fetus as well as injure the woman. But also the stress levels that are associated with the violence really has a profound impact on the developing fetus and the whole pregnancy. Violence really causes people to experience high levels of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, other anxiety disorders, sleeping disorders, eating disorders, and suicide attempts. So it has a profound effect on our mental health and our emotional health. When you grow up in violence, and here's this intergenerational, one of those factors, when you're exposed to violence in childhood, oftentimes there's no way for you to escape. And what the community supports and structures that need to be in place actually include the schools. It includes the faith institutions, the religious institutions. It should include community programs in neighborhoods, and it really should include government interventions so that there's some way for children to actually have a belief that they don't have to live in this violence indefinitely. But when you're exposed to violence and you're a victim of violence, in your childhood, and you don't have these other opportunities, or you don't see other examples of what could be possible, then there's a sense of hopelessness and helplessness that can occur as a result. And of course, that could lead to the depression, the mental health disorders that we discussed. Health effects also include everything, that you can think of, from headaches, back pain, abdominal pain, stomach issues, limited mobility, and poor overall health. There was a comprehensive study done by Dr. Folletti in the United States years ago, and he looked at adverse childhood experiences. And one of the things that he found was that if you experienced adverse childhood experiences, then your overall health outcomes as an adult would be impacted. And Dr. Folletti was a cardiologist who was trying to do all these interventions with people who had health issues and heart issues, and would get them on programs to lose weight and get healthier. And invariably, they would fall back into some of the behaviors that would contribute to exacerbating some of their health issues. And he really wanted to understand why that was occurring. And as a result of that, I began to do this research project around what is contributing to the lack of change that could produce more positive health outcomes, and identified that when people are exposed to certain levels of violence and what he termed as adverse childhood experiences, that overall has this ultimate effect on kind of our emotional and psychological, as well as our behavioral health. And so people who experience that high levels of violence might be much more likely to engage in behaviors to self-medicate, whether it's smoking or drinking, drugs, to try to cope with the experience of the depression, the violence, the anxiety that they might be experiencing. And overeating could be one of those particular behaviors. And also just the stress. We know that stress on the body produces profound health outcomes, negative health outcomes for individuals. So anyway, these things that happen early in childhood and that happen across the lifetime actually continue in our health as even if we are removed from those violent situations. So it has a very long, profound impact on overall health. Sexual violence, particularly during childhood, leads to that substance use, that, as I mentioned, and also risky sexual behavior often in life. And it's associated with the perpetration of violence for males. So, again, if males experience childhood violence, then they're more likely to perpetrate it. Not all men who experience childhood violence perpetrate, and thank goodness not all women who experience childhood violence actually end up in situations where they're also experiencing intimate partner violence in their relationships. And that's a positive thing. But what we do know is that if you do experience this in childhood, then the likelihood you're going to experience it or perpetrate violence in the case of males has increased. So it's one of the areas where we want to really focus on early prevention and intervention. One of the things we have to do is we actually have to get government and community leaders involved in affecting change, both in terms of the regulations and the consequences and the laws, also as well as providing the kinds of resources and opportunities the community supports, whether it's in schools and education, but also community supports in general to wrap around those families, because the financial costs as a result of violence against women and children are really extensive. And so there was a study in 2003 for the United States, and they found that intimate partner violence cost the United States roughly like $5.8 billion per year. And a more recent one done in Australia, they estimated that the intimate partner violence costs $13.6 billion in 2009. just as a result of the intimate partner violence. And so you think about things like cost, it's cost of loss of productivity. So, women who have experienced violence and they have jobs may not be able to go to work because of the bruising or the injuries or the death. It's the cost of police and intervention. It's the cost in terms of families who now need resources because they're not able to sustain any kind of employment. I mean, those costs just kind of go out in concentric circles and impact society as a whole. And it's one of the ways in which we might be able to engage government to be more proactive in their interventions and funding these kind of interventions. So, taking a look at prevention and response, as I mentioned earlier, we definitely need to enact and enforce legislation and develop and implement policies that promote gender equality. Here's a couple of them, and I'm going to talk a little bit about data as well. But one, we need to end the discrimination against women in marriage, divorce, and custody laws. There's a lot of places where men actually have much more rights in these particular areas than women do. We need to end discrimination in inheritance laws and ownership of assets so that women can inherit and benefit from the economic riches that may exist or economic benefits that may exist within a family. We need to improve women's access to paid employment so that they actually have jobs and are able actually to operate in a way that they can be independent and flee the violence and not be completely dependent on perpetrators of the violence. And then developing and resourcing national plans and policies to address violence against women. We recently in the United States here in the county where I live, we recently did a study on women and girls in our county. And one of the things that came out was that there was a high rates of violence. And in fact, so I live in the state of California. Our county experienced violence against women and girls is one of the highest counties. There's 58 counties and we're like 55th out of 58, meaning that's a bad level for having violence against women and girls. But as we began to dig into this data and take a look a little bit more what that meant, what we see is that the data collection differs from jurisdiction. So from city to city is different, kind of different levels of data collection. So it's hard to get our handle around it. There's different levels of responses. So within this one county, we have 7 cities. We have a city that actually has really taken, and for years has been proactive in taking the steps to go ahead and make sure that they have social workers. They're able to connect victims of violence to the services. They're able to connect them to legal services and victim rights services. They're able to make sure that they get legal counsel so that they can file things like restraining orders to keep the perpetrators of violence away from them and away from their children, to connect them to the resources and shelters so that if they need to flee the home environment because the violence is bad and it won't stop, that they actually have a shelter where they can go. And this shelter is a place where the perpetrators aren't known. So it's a confidential shelter where the women and children can go. And while they're in that shelter, they're actually able to receive things like counseling, job skills, jobs training, counseling for the kids, just giving them some time to begin to treat their mental health, the levels of depression and anxiety and fear that they might feel, to help the children have a sense of stability and begin to feel more successful in school, to begin to meet some of their basic needs, because a lot of times women remain in abusive and violent situations because they have no way economically to support themselves or to support their children. And so it becomes one of those cases where they feel that they need to stay with the perpetrator of the violence, their partner or their husband, their spouse, because that person is the primary breadwinner. They're the ones that bring in the income. The other thing that happens is so often perpetrators of violence actually threaten women. So, if you leave me, the police will take my side, the courts will take my side, I will get the children, you will be, kind of an outcast. You're not going to be accepted into the community. You'll just basically be this pariah. And they're so good at communicating that information to women, that they're often terrified to actually leave. But part of the violence also is separating them from natural supports that might be kind of more healthy relationships. So if the woman comes from a place where she actually had some healthy friendships, and maybe she had some healthy family relationships, oftentimes a perpetrator of violence was going to take active steps to isolate her and isolate the family so that they no longer have those kinds of connections, to reach out for support so that they can remove the violence. So coming back to city and jurisdictions, one city in our county, and actually a second city has started to do this, actually has a social worker. They have a whole team, a family intervention, violence intervention response team that goes out and to connect the women and the children to the services, make sure that they get the legal supports that they need, make sure they get the financial supports that they need, and make sure that they're actually connected to the tools that's going to help them become economically independent so that they can sustain themselves and their families away from that situation. In other cities, actually, they don't have those policies. They don't have those kinds of programs. From the data perspective, when we're looking at legislation and policies, just again, one state of California, one county, 7 different kinds of responses. What we see is that depending on the values of the policing system, kind of the level of corruption that might occur within the policing system, the level of normalizing violence and gender violence in particular in the policing system, maybe being understaffed, the way that they capture reports and data, all of those things factor into our understanding and really a comprehensive view of the level of violence that might be occurring in the community. And we need to make sure that there's some consistency across these different jurisdictions to make sure that women have these opportunities. Some of the other prevention and response, maybe before I go forward, a key piece of this is women's access to paid employment and ultimately getting the job skills that they need in order to be able to get living wage employment that they can support themselves. And that means a lot of different things in different contexts, but having those opportunities and skills. And so sometimes it's a long process for women to actually move from the place of fleeing the violence in the situation and in the household to actually feeling self-sufficient and independent and being able to support oneself. It's a long process. So the World Health Organization says, the health sector can take some steps in all of this. And one of the things they can do is advocate to make violence against women unacceptable, and then also really call it a public health problem, because violence is a public health problem and it has a profound impact on people's, again, mental health, psychological health, as well as physical health. And all of those things have an impact on the kind of the societal economic health and societal mental health and behavioral health. So the kind of levels of violence that we see within a community, for example, health providers and service providers should take comprehensive services. They should sensitize and train their providers in responding to the needs of survivors holistically and empathetically. So really to be on the ground, in the trenches, understanding the dynamics and the cycles of violence that may occur, understanding why women may be afraid to leave those situations. In some cases, in places where there's really high levels of poverty, there's no opportunity. It's really hard to flee those situations. And particularly where there's adopted widespread gender norms of violence and acceptance of violence, and gender norms of seeing women as inferior to males. The other thing that the health sector and other service providers can do is prevent the recurrence of violence through the early identification and intervention. So when we see that women are experiencing violence and children are experiencing violence, it's a time to intervene quickly so that children, one, have an opportunity to not be exposed to this over the long haul, and then they're going to get the kinds of supports and services that they need and opportunities they need to be successful as they grow up. It's one of those ways in which we can begin to prevent kind of like that getting upstream to prevent the violence that might happen into the next generation. We need to promote egalitarian gender norms as part of life skills, and do comprehensive sexual education so that there's just a greater level of education for males and females. And then really do more research on what's working and the magnitude of the problem, to carry out population-based surveys or violence against women in population-based and health surveys. So we need more data, we need more research, we need a better understanding of these issues. And the health sector and other community services all play a role in that. So if we just look at just broad categories of effective interventions, community mobilization and supports. So as a community mobilizes to support women in that community, and they provide resources and supports that can include things like the communications and skill building, life building skills, a deeper understanding of navigating those kinds of relationships and in those environments, doing early interventions, and then the economic interventions to enhance livelihoods, income for men and women. For a long time, and some of the work that I did with my colleagues, Dr. Lewis and Dr. Stevens, really relates to helping microfinanced women-run organizations to increase the economic livelihood and stability of the family. And so some of the initial work that we did was in the Dominican Republic in particular. We were working with these microfinanced women-led greenhouse associations, and these were in highly rural, highly impoverished areas. And when we were doing the work, some of the communities we'd been in had just gotten running water and electricity within like 9 months to a year, so prior to our arrival. So very limited in terms of the kinds of resources that they had available. They were funded through USAID and through this farmer to farmer program. And the idea was that in these communities, the men, when they made money, they spent it on other women. So they had multiple, extramarital affairs. They spent it on gambling. They spent it on drinking. And so they weren't investing the money that they made back into the families. Whereas the idea is that a lot of women actually will invest in the family. So they're going to make sure their children have clothes. They're going to make sure their children have food. They're going to make sure their children get opportunities to education, get opportunities to skills development that might influence their careers and where they go. And so in that work, we did some similar work in Guatemala and supporting, and just doing a really kind of an evaluation of a program that supports microfinanced, again, women backstrap weavers who were bringing in income to help support the overall well-being of the family. What the studies, though, and in the past couple of years, the thing that I personally have been concerned about is if violence stems, if men perpetrate violence in part because of their exposure to violence when they were children, in part because of their low education and also living in poverty, their low opportunities, higher stress levels, then we need to have interventions for men as well. And the UK Aid What Works program, actually in that research, they found that it was really important to do economic interventions for men and really enable men to increase their livelihood. So if you think about it, higher levels of income means you can better take care of your family, meet basic needs. It gives individuals a sense of self-esteem and self-worth, a sense of identity, both as a provider, as a male, as a member of the community, and ultimately can lower stress levels. And that actually has been shown to reduce violence in the study areas. So it's not just economic improvements for women, but also for men. And in fact, in one of their studies, they found that the economic interventions for men actually lowered the violence, where the economic interventions for the women didn't necessarily lower the violence for the women because we weren't treating, in this case, they weren't treating the males in those in that situation. And of course, the amount of income, increased income that the women earned was pretty marginal. So it didn't allow them to really make a substantial change in their environments. So there's a whole lot left to learn. We know that there's this intersection from this really global notion of, the value of women. And we have a lot of work to do in terms of women equality and ensuring that women are seen as equal as valuable, and that we reduce global and societal norms of violence against women. And that includes the physical violence, but it also includes the sexual violence. So we must do it on those levels. And that's very structural and macro in the level. But then coming down into the micro levels in our interventions, we have to focus on what is the immediate context in which the violence is occurring. So again, that's going to change, right? And some of it's going to be impacted on, is it a current conflict zone, or is it a past conflict zone? Because then we know that exacerbates the violence and the stress that's going on. Is it high poverty rates? What's the poverty and the opportunity for economic advancement, for education, and for access to health and other kinds of services? Those play a role, and all of those intersect then to look at the individual relationships that men and women find themselves in, and then developing targeted interventions based on that greater context. But ultimately, I think as we just look at this situation, we've come a long ways across the globe. We've got a long ways to go. It's the violence that's occurring in Nigeria and across the world, the sexual violence, the rapes, the killings, the incredible brutality has got to stop. And, we've got to take action both at that really government level, global level, and then down to the local communities. But as I just kind of wrap up, what I wanted to share with you all is, again, I want to restate that women aren't responsible for the violence that happens against them. It's not your fault. It's not their fault. It's not the fault of children who experience the violence. There's all of these other external factors that come into play on a person's and a family's and a community's overall well-being. So, it's a very complex situation. It's a very complex issues, but there are interventions that we can do. And, one of them is just to be an advocate and to really advocate for change and rallying support and mobilizing the community to take a stand against this. So with that, are there any questions?
Someone was trying to call now, but I had to cut her off because you were still speaking then. But
sorry.
Yeah, a few questions. No, few questions, because we were supposed to call after you finished speaking, not while you were speaking. That was the instruction. Few questions. For someone who's been abused, especially in workplace, and it's scared of victimization, because they say, oh, if you come out and report the other, okay, like in schools,
Mm-hmm.
there was a situation where the lecturers will actually harass the female students, and if you go out and report, even if the lecturer gets into trouble, the other lecturers, like a teamwork, they will now start victimizing you. So for someone that has that belief, what should the person do in that situation?
If somebody is, and I just want to restate this, but so if somebody's being sexually harassed by a person in authority, whether it's at school or at work, and then they fear that if they say anything, there'll be retribution. What should they do? Is that the question?
Yeah. What should they do?
Yeah. So, this is complicated because I think part of it is really understanding what are the laws that would protect women who are experiencing that kind of sexual harassment, looking at the particular organization, and are there any steps to take within that organization? So are there policies and procedures within the workplace or within the school place that says we will not accept violence of any sort, we will not accept sexual harassment of any sort, and making sure that those things are in place, and then finding out if there's, oftentimes they'll have like confidential ways that you can report these situations happening, and then moving forward, following that path of confidential ways. It's without knowing the specific circumstances, it's very real that people could lose their job if they report it. And, I think that, or, experience, depending on how wide that gets, really harassment in some level. And so I think you really have to do really an assessment on the country, the locale, the geographic location where you live, the organization that's doing it, what are the national rules about that? What kind of recourse do you have? And did the organization adopt policies and give you a confidential way to follow up in filing for this? I think, as someone who was a child in violent situations, the thing that I did as a child, because I would just try to curtail, so I would avoid the perpetrator in any way that I possibly could. And that's not always an option for people. But one of the things that does help is not being alone. So being with groups and friends, that helps reduce the opportunity for those things to occur. But again, really checking and seeing what's there to support women through it. And then if there's nothing within the organization as a pathway, then reaching out to any kinds of community-based organizations, NGOs that might provide the kinds of support and counseling and maybe legal advocacy so that there is a pathway to move forward.
Yeah, oh, beautiful. Thank you very much. Yeah, they have organizations in Nigeria, that NGOs in Nigeria that into the women and children, like I know Plan Organization and some other organizations. One other thing that is responsible why people don't speak out is because of the stigmatization. They're scared that, if I come out and say I was abused, I was raped, people will now stigmatize me. I may not even get a husband to marry. That's the belief. So in that situation, how can they get out of that?
Yeah, so that's the place where, you have to challenge the greater kind of societal norms that say women are at fault for being raped, that women are damaged goods if they've been raped, and, begin to change the ways in which that is communicated and supported within the families and within the communities. Because those are tough when there are societal norms that adopt and believe that. It's really tough to take action and come out because of the stigma. But what I would say to women in those situations is reach out to those organizations that work with women who have been targeted for, the sexual violence, who have been raped, assaulted, physically assaulted in any way. Reach out to them, seek the kinds of counseling that they have locally, the kinds of resources that they have locally to support them. And, those organizations and the people that work in those organizations should really be adept at identifying what the risk factors are, as well as connecting into the kinds of supports that they may need, to move forward. Definitely need access to healthcare and an intervention. And if there's any kind of legal enforcement as a result of that, then often, in the United States here, we have what we call, SART, sexual assault response teams, who actually can collect information, kind of DNA evidence that can be used to prosecute the perpetrators. So to the extent that there's something like that in Nigeria or in other parts across the globe, then really making sure that you follow those steps by reaching out to, again, an NGO who works with victims of violence and sexual violence, and doing it right away, reaching out to them right away to follow those kinds of steps, so that there ultimately needs to be consequences. People need to face prison. They need to face consequences for this behavior. It should not be acceptable at all. It should not be acceptable.
Oh, beautiful. I remember some time ago, about a couple of years back, and someone called me, and she was being actually abused by her husband. She was being raped by her husband, So because all these organizations, will have them in Nigeria, but they're there, but people don't engage them, I know there's one in Lagos. Mm-hmm. And so I gave her the number of a lawyer, an attorney. They called this person. The lawyer told her what to do. Go to this organization, call them. They have a response team that will come and, help you. And after a few days, she now said, let me just leave him. He's the father of my children. I don't want to go that route. And today she's actually suffering, but suffering in silence, and she cannot speak out. So such people, what do they need to do? Because there's provision, for them there, but they do not engage those organizations out of, I don't know, Yeah.
Yeah. I think if they don't engage in those organizations and there's not community support, they don't have friends or relatives who actually, one, challenge those notions that they're damaged goods as a result of that, and two, support them to seek the kinds of services that they need to heal and move forward in their lives, then I think that's a real challenge for the women themselves. What I would say is that people that are community leaders, faith leaders, community leaders, and NGOs, they need to be really active in engaging the community early prior to that violence. And I know the violence is ongoing, right? So it's getting in there, establishing those relationships, reducing the fears, showing women what's available to them so that, and oftentimes using somebody like a kind of a trusted insider, so it could be somebody within the community, within the village, within the community that they trust, who actually has a relationship with that NGO and can really begin to foster that trust building relationship so that they feel like, one, their privacy will be respected, their confidentiality will be respected, that they're going to get the kinds of support that's non-judgmental but really helpful, and start, that's the community mobilization component, is really building and fostering those relationships that makes it acceptable to access the resources that are available. Challenging some of the cultural norms in the communities is a key piece of eliminating some of the barriers to access the resources that women need.
Oh, beautiful. And then how about people who suffered abuse while they were kids and still living with the trauma in adulthood? How can they get off that?
So how can women that are suffering abuse, are they still in the abusive situation?
Oh, no, not just still going through the effect of the abuse. It's now affecting the mental health. Yeah.
So, going to counseling, finding a counselor, an advocate, anyone who will, one, to communicate to those women that, first of all, it was not their fault. I think it's so hard not to get past that part that it's their fault. I mean, there's just this real internalization that can happen for women. But then really seeking the kinds of supports to address the mental health, any kind of depression and anxiety, seeking supports that are going to enable them to feel, maybe advanced economically or advanced in terms of the opportunities that they have, where they can remove themselves from situations where they might be being triggered and re-triggered in their trauma. So if they live in a small community where they actually have to see the perpetrator every day, it's harder to move past those things and feel more at peace than it is if you're in a different environment. And some of that just takes time. So much of this post-traumatic stress just stays with individuals for a long time. So there's different kinds of therapies that people can do. It's getting in support groups with other people who've experienced the violence and supporting one another. And then really, creating those kinds of relationships that are nurturing and supportive and non-threatening, right? So you got to really try to create environments that feel much more peaceful. And so all of that's about relationships. And oftentimes, I've seen women who've experienced violence, and then the people that they may have left that violent situation, but the people that they hang out with are negative. Maybe they still do a lot of what we would call victim blaming, and really make the woman feel at fault. Or maybe they still live in a community of violence, and so their friends still have violence that are going on, whether it's violence in the streets or violence in their households. Even if the woman's no longer immediately affected, that will have an impact on her mental health and her ability to feel, kind of restore some of her overall physical health as a result of the trauma, because it just keeps that trauma alive and triggered. And that's really tough. But there are also some interventions that people can do. There's no easy answer. There's just no easy answer. It's long-term effects.
Oh, beautiful. So thank you very, very much, Rochelle. It's been wonderful. I believe that our viewers have enjoyed your your presentation. And I would love to ask, will you guys, your team, be able to take your intervention to Nigeria?
Yes, once COVID lifts, we would love to do that.
Okay.
So, yes.
Yeah, beautiful. So we'll start working on it. We hope COVID leaves very
Sounds
soon.
great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We pray for a peaceful and a better 2021.
Yes, that's right.
So thank you very much. Yeah, it's been wonderful having you. And our viewers, thank you all for joining us today. Those of you, we have people, watching you, Rochelle, from Facebook and from Twitter, from all over, about 8 platforms here.
Wow.
Beautiful. Yeah. So if they have any questions, can we share your slide with them?
Yes.
Oh, okay, beautiful. So, okay, I'll share the slide I'll get the slide from you and share on the platforms.
I'll send it your way.
All right. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yes, thank you very much, viewers. That was Rochelle Sherlock speaking on abuse and the mental health in women. I hope you all enjoyed it. So I'll be sharing the slide will be on the Nigerian Diaspora TV Facebook page, so you can get it from there if you're interested. Thank you, and God bless you all.
This is Nigeria, the real home of the black people. We are great nation, great nation, Nigeria.